Thank you, everyone, for coming. We're so happy to have you all here today for these two wonderful writers. We are just recording it for Zoom, but no one's out there on the Zoom audience, but just we will put it up on YouTube at the end of the year. So we don't deplete from their tour. My name is Jennifer Franklin. I'm the program director of the Hudson Valley Writers Center. So good to have all of you here today. I want to thank the Hudson Valley Writers Center board, the students, the teachers, and all of the foundations who support us, and all of the donors like you. The David T. Taft Foundation, the Bidell Foundation, and also Arts Westchester and NISCA. Please check out our entire calendar for April. We have a reading every week. It is National Poetry Month, so we have a lot of things coming up, including Westchester Poetry Festival on the 29th of April, which has Patricia Smith, Ilya Kaminsky, and 5 other poets. So please come out to the Master School in Dallas Ferry for that, if you like poetry as well as prose. Today, we are so happy to introduce 2 great prose writers. So I think maybe what I'll do is I'll introduce both of them now, because they're going to read for you from their new books, and then they're going to have a Q&A. They're going to ask each other some questions, and they're going to take questions from all of you. Okay. Guy Chakrabarti is the author of the novel, A Play for the End of the World by Knopf, which was the National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. It was also the Association of Jewish Libraries Honor Book, was shortlisted for the Tagore Prize, and was longlisted for the Faulkner Award. He is also the author of the wonderful short story collection, A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness. His short fiction has appeared in One Story, Electric Lit, A Public Space, Conjunctions, Gulf Coast, Michigan Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. It has been anthologized in the O. Henry Prize Stories, the Best American Short Stories, and awarded a Pushcart Prize, and also performed on selected shorts. His nonfiction has been published in the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, Writer's Digest, Her Voice, and The Hub. He was an emerging writer fellow with A Public Space and received an MFA in creative writing from Brooklyn College. He is also a trained computer scientist. Born in India, he now lives in New York with his family. The first story in Jai's exquisite collection, A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness, the New York Times says, is hard to top. Among the many ways in which he demonstrates a mastery of the form is that each tale feels immersive and complete, yet leaves the reader wanting more. He has been a friend of the center since his first book was published, and he read for us on Zoom. He teaches fiction for us, and we're so happy to welcome him to read today in person at the center. This is your first time being here. Carolyn Ferrell is the author of the novel Dear Miss Metropolitan, which came out in the height of the pandemic, July 2021. It was a finalist for both the 2022 Faulkner Award and a finalist for the 2022 Hemingway Award. Her short story collection, Don't Erase Me, received the Art Seidenbaum Award from the Los Angeles Times Book Prize program, and the C. Zacharias Award given by Plowshares. He's also received grants from the Fulbright Association, the German Academic Exchange, the City University of New York Magnet Program, and the NEA. Her stories have been anthologized in Best American Short Stories 2018 and the Best American Short Stories of the Century, among other places. She teaches creative writing at Sarah Lawrence, and in a wonderful interview that I read online, she explains how her teaching influences her writing more than the other way around. Dear Miss Metropolitan explores the intersections of grief and rage, personal strength and healing, and what we owe one another. Like Colston Whitehead's The Nickel Boys, Carolyn Ferrell's Dear Miss Metropolitan gives voice to characters surviving unimaginable tragedy. As the New York Times writes, it's a difficult novel to read. The subject matter is about as grim as it gets. He tells the story of 3 young girls who are kidnapped and thrown into the basement of a house in Queens. Prepare yourself. Once there, they are tortured and raped for a decade. It becomes clear, and not for the first time, that Ferrell is navigating American trauma, writ large, as well as her character's own. Some nightmares, the New York Times says, are not easily outrun. Please help me welcome these 2 incredible novelists.
So great to be here with you all and with Carolyn, whom I admire so much. And I was just thinking about when Jennifer was reading my bio with the line about me being a computer scientist, feels like the 2 truths and a lie game, you know, that's the thing that just right, makes sense here. But I'm gonna read, how long should I read for?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, you got it. So I'm gonna read from the title story. And, you know, I'm going to talk about first a little bit of the genesis of how the title story came to be. So I was born in the small town of Kolkata, India. That's a joke. It's not a small town. It's really, really bustling. But, you know, I would go to my grandparents' house and they lived in one of these old colonial buildings built during the British occupation of India. And it was really falling apart and crumbling. And one day when I was on the roof, I was observing how everything was changing around them, and yet they were living in this kind of like relic of British Indian history. And I was thinking about, you know, a loved one who was gay and who was, you know, afraid to talk about it in public. And the idea for this story came to me because I was trying to, like, you know, frame these ideas of, well, you've got on one hand a kind of desire to be with tradition, which my grandparents certainly did, and those who came into their house were very aware of that. And then this desire for love and acceptance in a more expansive way. And so that's where a small sacrifice for an enormous happiness came to be. From his balcony, Nikhil waited and watched the street as hyacinth braiders tied floral knots, rum sellers hauled bags of ice, and the row of elderly typists who had seemed elderly to him since he'd been a boy, struck the last notes of their daily work. Beside him on the balcony, his servant Kanu plucked at the hair that grew from his ears. "Keep a lookout for Babu," Nikhil shouted to Kanu. "I'll check on the tea." Kanu was so old he could neither see nor hear well, but he still accepted each responsibility with enthusiasm. The tea was ready, as were the sweets, the whole conical pile of them, the base layer of pistachio mounds, the center almond bars that Nikhil had rolled by hand himself, and on the top 3 lychees from the garden, so precariously balanced, a single misstep would have upset their delectable geometry. When he returned to the balcony, he saw Sharma walking up the cobbled lane, his oiled hair shining in the late afternoon light. The typist greeted him with a verse from a Bollywood number. Sharma's boxer's jaw and darling eyes reminded the typist of an emerging movie star, and Sharma shook his head and laughed. Kanu limped downstairs to let Sharma in, and Nikhil waited in the living room while the 2 of them made their way up. "And what is the special occasion?" Sharma asked, eyeing the pile of confections with a boyish grin. Nikhil refused to say. He allowed Sharma to have his fill, watching with satisfaction as his fingers became honey glazed from the offering. Afterward, when they lay on the great divan, hand carved and older than his mother's ghost, Nikhil breathed deeply to calm his heart. He feared the words would be eaten in his chest, but he'd been planning to tell Sharma for days, and there was no going back now. As evening settled, the air between them became heavy with the sweetness of secrecy, but secrecy had a short wick. My dearest, fairest boy, he said, I want our love to increase. Sharma raised his eyebrows, those lines thickly drawn, nearly fused. Who better than Sharma to know Nikhil's heart? I desire to have a child with you, Nikhil said. Nikhil had trouble reading Sharma's expression in the waning light, so he repeated himself. His fingers were shaking, but he took Sharma's hand anyway, gave it a squeeze. I heard you the first time, Sharma said. A rare, cool wind had prompted Nikhil to turn off the ceiling fan, and now he could hear the rum sellers on the street enunciating prices in sing-song Urdu. He touched Sharma's face, traced the line of his jaw, unsure still of how his lover had received his news. Likely, Sharma was still mulling. He formed his opinions, Nikhil believed, at the pace the street cows strolled. Nikhil waited out the silence as long as he could. Listen, he finally said, the country is changing. A child diapered by two men, said Sharma. Your country is changing faster than my country is changing. What about the boys from Kerala? They had learned about a school teacher and a postal clerk who'd secretly made a life together. Unfashionably attired and chubby-cheeked, they seemed too dull for the news. A few months ago, locals threw acid in their faces. Even in the black and white of the photographs, there's scars along the jaw, the nose, the better half of a cheek. 10 years since man had landed on the moon, and still, we are not boys from Kerala, we are protected. No ruse better than a woman in the home, Nikhil had argued over a year ago, and eventually Sharma had agreed to a marriage of convenience. Kanu, who loved Nikhil through his childhood and even through his years of chasing prostitutes, had arranged for a village woman who knew about the two men's relationship but would never tell. Nikhil rummaged through his almirah and returned with a gift in his hands. You, close your eyes now. Oh, Nikhil. But Sharma did as he was told, accustomed now perhaps to receiving precious things. Around Sharma's neck, Nikhil tied his dead mother's necklace. It had been dipped in 24 carats of gold by master artisans of Agra. Miniature busts of Queen Victoria decorated its circumference, a piece for the museums, a jeweler had once explained. But Nikhil wanted Sharma to have it. That morning, when he visited the family vault to retrieve it, he'd startled himself with the enormity of what he was giving away, but what better time than now, as they were about to begin a family. Promise you'll dream about a child with me. It is beautiful, and I will wear it every day, even though people will wonder what is that under my shirt. Let them wonder. You are entirely mad. Mad is what you are. Nikhil was pulled back to the divan. Sharma, lifting Nikhil's shirt, placed a molasses square on his belly, teasing a trail of sweetness with his tongue. Nikhil closed his eyes and allowed himself to be enjoyed. Down below, the rum sellers negotiated, the prices of bottles fluctuating wildly. Afterward, they retired to the roof. Their chadors cut off the cold, but Nikhil still shivered. When Sharma asked what the matter was, Nikhil kissed the spot where his eyebrows met. There was another old roof across the street where grandmothers were known to gossip, eavesdrop, but he did not care. Let them see, he thought. Let them feel this wind of enormous change. The next morning, while Sharma washed, Nikhil said, I want you to toss the idea to your wife, get Tripti used to the matter. Sharma dried himself so quickly he left behind footprints on the bathroom's marble floor. Toss the idea to my wife, get her used to the matter, Sharma repeated before he changed into his working clothes, leaving Nikhil to brood alone. Tripti would have few issues with the arrangement of a child, Nikhil believed. After all, at the time of her marriage to Sharma, her family was mired in bankruptcy. Her father had left them nothing but a reputation for drink and dishonesty, and she herself, insofar as he recalled from his soul meeting with her at the wedding, was a dour, spiritless creature who deserved little of the bounty that Nikhil had provided her. What little else he knew was from Kanu's reports. Extremely pliable, Kanu had first said, then closer to the wedding. Little stubborn about the choice of sweets. She wants village kind. On that note, Nikhil had wilted. Let her have her desserts, he'd said, the wedding paid for and the matter removed from mind. The next few days when Sharma was away at the village and at the foundry, Nikhil paced around the house, overcome by the idea of a child. He'd always dreamed of becoming a father, but had never believed it would be possible until this year's monsoon, when, in the middle of a deluge, his 42-year-old sister had given birth to a girl. The rain had been so fierce, no ambulance could ferry them to the hospital. So the elderly women of the family assumed the duties of midwifery and delivered the child themselves. The first moment he saw his niece, he merely believed in God, and strangely in his own ability, his right to produce so perfect a thing. He couldn't bring Sharma to his sister's house to meet his niece, so the next week he'd spent their Thursday together, sharing photos. If Sharma expected the same lightness of being, he didn't let it show. All he said was, quite a healthy baby she is. It was true. She'd been born 9 pounds, 2 ounces. The family had purchased a cow so that fresh milk would always be available. Nikhil convinced himself that he had opened Sharma's heart to the idea of becoming a father, but the exuberance of this conclusion led to certain practical questions. Sharma's wife would carry the child, but where would the child live? In Sharma's house in the village, or in Nikhil's house here in the city? If she lived in the village, which Nikhil admitted was the safer option, how would Nikhil father her? How would she receive a proper education? These questions consumed the hours. When he went to check on his tenants, he was distracted and unable to focus on their concerns. A leaky toilet, a broken window, the group of vagrants who'd squatted outside one of his properties, all these matters seemed trivial compared to his imagined child's needs. The next week, the afternoon before he would see Sharma again, he stepped into a clothing store on Rash Bihari Avenue to calm his mind. It was a shop he'd frequented to purchase silk kurtas for Sharma or paisley shirts for himself. He told the attendants he needed an exceptional outfit for his niece. They combed the shelves and found a white dress with a lacy pink bow. He imagined his own daughter wearing it. From his dreaming, he was certain a girl would come out of their love. Srishti was what he'd named her. Srishti enunciating like a princess, Srishti riding her bicycle up and down Kakulia Lane. Early on, they'd agreed that Nikhil would avoid the foundry, but he was feeling so full of promise for Srishti that he did not deter himself from continuing down Rash Bihari Avenue toward Toliganj Quarry, nor did he prevent himself from walking to the entrance of Mahesh Steel and asking for his friend. Sharma emerged from the uneven music of metalworking with a cigarette between his lips. His Apollonian features were smeared with grease. His hands were constricted by thick welding gloves, which excluded the possibility of even an accidental touch. When he saw Nikhil, Sharma scowled. "Sir," he said, "you'll have the parts tomorrow." Though he knew Sharma was treating him as a customer for good reason, the tone still stung. Nikhil whispered, "See what I've brought?" He produced the perfect baby girl dress. "You have lost your soup," Sharma whispered back. Then, so everyone could hear, "Babu, you'll have the parts tomorrow, latest tomorrow." Nikhil tried again. "Do you see the collar, the sweet lace? You should go to your home now," Sharma said. "Tomorrow I'll see you." But that Thursday, Sharma failed to visit. Nikhil and Kanu waited until 9:30 and then ate their meal together by lamplight. They met on Thursdays because it was on a Thursday that they had first met 3 years ago, at that time of year when the city is at its most bearable, when the smell of wild hyacinth cannot be outdone by the stench of the gutters, because it is after the city's short winter, which manages, despite its brevity, to birth more funerals than any other time of year. In the city's spring, two men walking the long road from Shantiniketan back to Kolkata because the bus has broken and no one is interested in its repair, are not entirely oblivious to the smells abounding in the wildflower fields, not oblivious at all to their own smells. He supposed he'd fetishized Sharma's smell from the beginning, that scent of a day's honest work, the smell of steel of the cheapest soap, the smell of a shirt laundered beyond its time, the smell of his night-bound stubble. He allowed his hand to linger on Sharma's wrist, pretending he was trying to see the hour, an hour before sunset, an hour after. He didn't remember exactly when they parted. What did it matter? What mattered were the coincidences of love. The day he saw Sharma for the second time, he counted among the small miracles of his life. Sharma was drinking tea at the tea stall on Kakulia Lane. He was leaning the weight of his body on the rotting wood of the counter, listening to the chaiwala recount stories. Later, he would learn that Sharma had landed a job at a nearby foundry and that this tea stall was simply the closest one. But in that moment, he didn't think of foundries or work or any other encumbrance. He thought instead of the way Sharma cradled his earthen teacup as if it were the Kohinoor. "Oh," he'd said, "did you and I, that broken bus, what an evening." Yes. A question that led to Thursdays. 2 years of Thursdays haunted by fear of discovery, which led to a wedding, because a married man who arrived regularly at Kakulia Lane could not be doing anything but playing backgammon with his happenstance friend. What followed was a year of bliss. He considered this time their honeymoon. They were as seriously committed as any partners who'd ever shared a covenant, and shouldn't that show? And I'll pause there, but I'll just mention that the one major character who's not in this story yet is Tripti, the would-be mother of his child. And let's say she's not as eager about his plan as he is. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tara. That was, is it sorry? Okay. Thanks so much. That was so beautiful. I first came across that story in the O. Henry Prize stories, right? And I have taught it. I teach at Sarah Lawrence. I've taught it many times, and it's just one of those what I call money back guarantee stories. You're gonna love it. You're gonna love it. It's so beautiful, and it just really exemplifies what, and I have there's a little Sarah Lawrence contingent here, but one of my former students, Marcia Bradley, is here. And I should say, Marcia just published her first novel, Away with Girls. Amazing. It's an amazing book. But your story really exemplified what a former teacher of mine, Edna O'Brien, once said, that yearning is really the greatest ingredient of literature. And that is, that's really true. So I'm just going to backtrack a tiny bit. Yes, Dear Miss Metropolitan is only grim. But I should say that one of my colleagues at Sarah Lawrence, who's also a writer, said it was the first book he'd ever read that had so many mentions of Judge Judy. So I think that it is really important when you deal with very difficult subject matter to have humor, to have levity, as a way to really humanize the characters. And one thing that I would like to talk about with you, because we both in our novels worked with historical events, mine loosely inspired, and yours, I think, more inspired, but I'd love to know more about that process for you. So I'm going to just read a few short sections from this novel. Let me just keep an eye on the time. And the first is actually, well, I should say about Dear Miss Metropolitan that it's a novel that is made up of fragments. So there are documents, there are letters, interviews, etc., that try to tell this story of three girls who have been kidnapped. And the first part of the book is actually a draft of a newspaper story that a young journalism intern is trying to complete. The newspaper is the Queens Metropolitan. It's from January 1, 2008. Preliminary draft special weekend feature. The title, They Would Not Let Go. Read this story, crossed out. Open these pages and you may feel sickened by the cruelties mentioned herein. Three girls are kidnapped and held hostage in a dilapidated house in the New York City borough of Queens. They become known as the victim girls. Their captor, a man described in vague terms by all the prominent news outlets, locks the girls away in chains, ropes, and other other devices, including thumbtacks and carpet nails. In his world, a paperclip can be as unholy as an iron maiden. Kidnapped victims can abound in a city like ours. Take that all out. Though each girl is abducted at different points, the aggregate period of confinement is 10 years, during which time crimes such as rape, asphyxiation, verbal degradation, and general torture occur with frequency. A number of pregnancies are said to have resulted from the sexual assaults, though to the best knowledge of the forensic detectives assigned the case, only one pregnancy is carried to term. At the time of the rescue, one of the girls is not accounted for, leading investigators to suspect the worst. Currently, this veritable house of horrors has been left to its own volition. Local politicians continually ask to have the place razed or repurposed. Thus far, no one city agency has stepped up to meet this challenge. When asked, the residents of this leafy, somewhat cigarette-strewn neighborhood, hovering between Sutphin Boulevard to the west and Rockaway Boulevard to the south, have no real idea how to move forward. It appears they are still in some state of shock. None claims to have suspected a thing. Several weeks after the fact, the people of Amity Lane remain at a loss as to how such a criminal mastermind could have lived right under their noses all that time. Research, Amina Whitehead-Mensah, Queens Metropolitan Staff Intern. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and read a section where, if I can find it, I always have my Post-its and then I lose them. This is actually when two of the girls, Fern and Gwynnie, discover each other in the house. They're taken ill at different times, and this is when the first two girls discover each other. This section is called The Old College Try. So you all know what's about to happen. But before you get to those waterworks, another interruption. Dig, if you will, the picture. Two girls smiling. No, they are not on the boardwalk at Coney Island or Rockaway Beach, but their faces are about to break open. In other words, they're smiling the biggest watermelons God has ever seen. God, in fact, had to step back and admire his handiwork. Damn, did I do that? The girls' faces are bruised, their hands grimy gray. Chains, maybe barbed wire, snake into their silhouette. From the one side, they look like angels, even if they're on the cusp of their most gruesome decade ever. Because no amount of house dirt can hide those cherubic cheeks. From the other side, they look like the devil. No, they are not possessed, nor have they been drugged into altered states. These girls are cheery. One could even go so far as to say they are buoyant. And though they are moments away from being slung farther apart by big, huge, meaty man hands, the girls are positively upbeat. They have discovered each other. One time, two times, three. It's a secret, but they feel like shouting to the world, I am not alone. In the flash of a microscopic eye, they see each other's outlines and forget all doom and gloom. Forget that just moments ago, they believed they would die here, all by themselves, forgotten, left behind like so much dust bunny dirt. The truth is, the girls have found a way to each other. They found that if you claw against the sheetrock / floors / ceilings and find a gash or a slash in the fortifications, you can actually see one another. Gaze upon a new countenance. You. These girls are, as per the poem that Mr. Canton made us read, even though we were in Western Civ 1, surprised by joy, impatient as the wind, return to share the transport. Oh, with whom? Each other, match. These girls are relieved. It was as if they'd suddenly been blanked into normal girls in a normal world, and normal queens, flip phones on faces and Game Boys in pockets. Gwen and me recognized nose and eyeses, and in general, the full flavor of our faces, and we try to reach our cheeks with our hands, but those chains, never mind, at least we can see. You. Our imaginations rev back up. Gwen and I saw ourselves almost as if we were two characters in a book of fairy tales, two fun-loving females flaneuring around Flushing Meadows Park, or else strolling the ever-enticing Queens Center Mall, or dipping into an empty church about to take it over the way church should be taken over. Our fingers, worn to nubs in only 14 days or 14 months, felt like piano keys. I can hear you breathe. No, I can hear your breath. No, I can hear yours. Can you sing something just so I know you're real? We didn't dare say Boss Man's name, but we thought it many times, the air around us souring if we were quiet in our minds. But who could be quiet? Miracles were taking place. The hole in the dividing wall, concrete, muslin, cardboard, grew larger right before our eyes. There was no house wind, no toppling. I was a real shadow, and so was she. Even if all we could do was ask over and over again, are you there? And the answer, I am. And widen our eyes in astonishment. Does this mean? Does this mean? Does this mean? And soften our faces with each iteration. How can it not? I won't tell you everything that came immediately after that. It's so much. I'll leave that to your own fruitful imaginations. What I will share instead are the following fairy tales. They did happen to Gwen and me. Our voices ran like boulevards to and from each other. Do you remember what pizza tastes like? Hell, I can't even remember what pizza is. To hear a voice is to beg for a story. Our bones soon understood that we weren't each other's rescues, not in the freedom sense we begged for. Her profile and mine were all we had. Boss Man's victims, his dolls, his fatalities, his targets, his babushkas, his casualties, his don't call us victims because we're so much more than that. We eventually stopped crying. We told each other our nicknames. We asked the obligatory mother questions. We told each other stories. We promised each other we'd remain strong. We rejoiced a handful of minutes in human time. I'm Gwen, and maybe I can help you. I'm Fern. I mean the same thing. So I'm just going to read one other short section from the section that's actually about the title character, Miss Metropolitan. Miss Metropolitan is an advice columnist for the Queens Metropolitan. And one of the things I was trying to accomplish in the novel was a focus not on the crimes and the graphic brutality, but focus really on the aftermath of these crimes and the community's response. You know, how is the community responsible for these girls? You know, a lot of people just sort of felt like, well, that house kind of looks weird, I'm just going to look away. So that was the question I was grappling with. And Miss Metropolitan, she realizes what has happened, and she is taken over with a kind of survivor's guilt in the book. So this scene that I'm going to begin takes place in her newspaper office at the Queens Metropolitan, and she's in the process of she wants to report the story in her own way. They kind of look at her as this old-fashioned newspaper woman, as she likes to call herself, because she sort of does an Ann Landers column. But she's in the process of having a heart attack while she is delivering this. So, according to Miss Metropolitan, in quotes, watching the police lead that vicious rogue away is a sight never to be forgotten in the history of humankind. What she didn't mention in the article, however, was the way her heart had raced as she watched them handcuff the man formerly known as Ernest, or Ernesto. She didn't mention the way her throat collapsed as the police spotlight shone on the boarded windows of his house, where he kept the girls. She also failed to note that after the last ambulance pulled away, she believed she might be experiencing another attack of heart arrhythmia, a condition about which she told no one in the office. Every day, Miss Metropolitan felt certain she would collapse in the street, and none of her neighbors would notice. Dying alone had always been something of bad taste in her mouth. None of the above was reported in the article Matilda Marin submitted in person to the Queens Metropolitan on December 4th, 2007. She wanted to stick to the facts, as they taught her in newspaper school back in the day. But just the air alone, in the frenetic nighttime of the victim girls, sparked within her the need to describe, to unmask, to fully comprehend. When she arrived at the newsroom the next morning, the editor took the pages from Miss Metropolitan's hands, typewritten, double-spaced, marked up and down with whiteout and red pen, and thanked her. Last night indeed was a bad night, the editor said. Matilda Moran flopped into an office chair, placed a hand on her chest. Yes, it was a bad night, she said. It saved lives. She drifted, remembering that wool-dark sky laced with the fragrance of snow. She had just closed her bedroom windows and positioned herself at her vanity with a ream of stationery and the old blue lame she used for formal letters. Dear Murder, I know you are a thief. That Rosenthal did not just walk away on its own. Myrtle is her sister. Miss Maddie, the editor said, are you all right? She begins to write more, but suddenly there is a commotion outside. Matilda pushes the letter away, floats to the front door of her small brick ranch, once belonging to Daddy, who'd inherited it at Mommy's poor death. And there it is, sirens shrieking, ambulances sparking the street. She feels a shudder in the sidewalk trees. There are people gathering beyond her yard, stepping onto the porch steps. Matilda feels the cold go right through her bed jacket. One of her oldest neighbor friends, Frida Bent, is dangling not 20 feet away at the chain link fence. Frida, in this cold? Wasn't it near 10 o'clock? Didn't Frida always sit in front of Law and Order about this time? Matilda wants to ask her friend what's happening, but she doesn't. She is a newspaper woman, for heaven's sake, and her job is to find out the answers on her own. The street is pure mayhem, flashing lights and crowds and voices. As she wraps her bed jacket tightly around her chest, it occurs to Matilda that she must be at the scene of a crime. Frida Bent runs toward Matilda and shouts, "Can you believe this shit?" A few feet over, a policeman, puny as the day is short, Matilda notes, swivels on his heel and glares at Frida. How he can hear her above the din is unclear. Matilda cries out, "My friend doesn't mean nothing, officer, pay her no mind." But the puny policeman says nothing. His eyes are back across the street. Everyone's eyes are across the street. Matilda crimps down the broken cement steps, and poured the chain link fence separating her property from the sidewalk, street, and the house where all the turmoil was happening. A line of EMTs hover near the front door, talking amongst themselves. Police pace up and down and sideways. Matilda's bed jacket has fallen from her shoulders, but she aches too much to bend down for it. In another time, a gentleman would have offered her his coat as an act of gallantry. Chivalry is dead, she thinks, or at least on a CPAP machine, wheezing out its last dogged breaths. Where are those days, she wonders, huffing towards the puny policeman. She feels old as the hills, but has not forgotten her mission. Good evening, officer. Might you be so kind as to tell me what is going on? Stay back, both of you, the puny cop says brusquely. One of his hands goes to his gun, the other to his radio. Matilda and Frida look at each other. Would it be nice, Matilda wants to ask, if people just went the extra mile to be kind?
Yes.
Doesn't take a lot to be kind. A smile is friend turned upside down. She knows Frida does not share such thoughts. Why bother asking? This neighbor woman, a confidant of 20 years, can be crude in situations requiring tact and a watchful eye. In situations like this, a woman like Frida Bent has no real purpose. Wake up, Miss Maddie, the editor said. Don't you hear me? Charlie, call 911. Call 911. But still, Frida grabs Maddie's hand and the two women move toward the crowd, a bulwark of nightgown, pajama bottom, hair curlered persons flapping their arms in the cold. These two women get no farther than the curve of the sidewalk. Rubberneckers, Matilda notes. What are they doing on my turf? Gawkers, pure and simple. They must have come a long way to witness the spectacle. Jamaica Avenue, Farmers Boulevard, the Long Island Expressway, all the number streets. They should have stayed in their own backyard, goddamn burglars. Lord have mercy on this shit, Frida says. Do you know what's happening, Matilda asks. Yes, but not exactly, Frida says. Long neighborhood trees darken the already pitch sky. An army of police smash in the door at the house across the street. A battering ram, a log. The wood splinters into the air, and sounds of high wailing can be heard. Cries forming circles in the air, from soft to loudest. Shards hang off the door frame. It takes no more than a minute for 3 bodies to appear. 3 girl bodies, maybe. 3 who clearly have not seen the light of day since forever. Matilda notes they are nothing but pale brown rust. The girls, if they can be called girls, stand there and sway slightly. It doesn't seem that they have any limbs. The crowd in the street agitates. Matilda finds their movements unseemly. She tries to listen. That man had those girls in the house for years and years, and we didn't know. We didn't look. They're nothing but skin and bones. I can't look anymore. Tell me what you see. I always thought that house looked strange. They say them girls been missing since Hurricane Floyd. I lost my everything in Hurricane Floyd. We didn't know. Look at them. Who can blame us? Look at them. Look. Matilda feels her chest constrict, like the rolling tight of an oriental carpet. Daddy's favorite room lay in the dining room, right under the cabinet containing Mother's European linens. Oh heavens, is this real or a dream? Why is there wood debris dangling so dangerously in that doorway? Are those girls actual living creatures? Matilda almost can't breathe, almost. Where is my steno pad? My writing hand should be moving. This has been her neighborhood for over 40 years, the home of all her friends and their families and their children. This is where she walks and feels every spring pebble in the sidewalk, predicts when every summer leaf will hit the ground. Doors were not supposed to bust down like that. Those splinters might just about kill any survivors, but survivors of what? Matilda shudders. Her chest repeatedly tries to go back to normal. We've known this world forever, she thinks. The trees, the windows, the streets, and the doors. When will our knowing stop? Matilda feels like smacking Frida's face. These girls are the exact opposite of death, she imagines herself saying. Frida, who hasn't heard a thing, whose neck is craned towards the action across the street, pure electricity, electrocution. Matilda takes her reading glasses from the top of her head. The girls swaying in the doorway do indeed look like death, she thinks, noticing the faint outline of hands. Matilda takes out her pad. preliminary notes, law enforcement, cop cars swarm the Cape Cod across the street, not like rabbits, but like wasps, hornets, or summer yellow jackets. Didn't that house used to be a Victorian? Didn't that house used to have eaves hanging down like honeycombs? When? When did it get so homely? Homey, dangerous doors, shards. Who will see to that? And why all this commotion? Maybe just some runaways now having to face the music. Do rescues always necessitate such din? Wouldn't soothing quiet be so much better for any liberatory actions to be carried out successfully? Daddy's favorite adage, better safe than sorry. Miss Metropolitan opens her eyes. Thank you.
The microphone and the podium, so that you don't have that lock in it.
Yes.
You can just.
So. Well, so maybe I'll kick off with the questions.
Yes, please do, John.
So when I read Dear Miss Metropolitan, I felt like it was a book like no other in the way in which, the first time I encountered Borges or Thomas Bernhardt, I was like, oh, this is truly a unique form, formally and in the way you approach the book. And you talked earlier about how teaching had been an influence for your writing. So I'm curious in particular how, and you taught for quite a few years. I'm curious how your teaching and kind of the ways in which you surveyed literature for many years, like how that influenced your structural and formal choices for DMM.
That's really a great question. Well, one thing I'll say on a practical level, teaching has been a huge influence. And well, I would say, I use a different word here. It's been a huge part of my writing because I've been teaching full-time at Sarah Lawrence for a long time. And I've also, my husband in the back, have raised 2 kids. And on a practical note, it was very much about finding that time to write and just kind of scrambling. And I know Alice Munro once wrote about trying to find time and how the short story really fit her agenda because she raised 3 kids and she didn't publish her first book until she was in her 30s. So, and my first book of short stories I published when I was 35. So on a practical level, I had to find that balance between teaching and writing, and it made me very, very focused when I had writing time. But on a more, I don't know, influential level, I've always enjoyed teaching writers who teach me how to write. And Marcia, I know I'm going to ask you to help me remember everyone that I teach, but of course, the first person I always say, Edward P. Jones. Edward P. Jones is a writer. When I read his short stories, and I teach him very often, he teaches me how to write. His short stories are amazing. The Known World was an inspiration for Dear Miss Metropolitan because it's an unusual novel in that it has an almost 19th century Victorian form, and yet it's really made up of short stories. So in thinking about how I would structure this book, I knew it could not be linear. And I just thought about the power of story in Edward P. Jones's work and in novelists I really, really admire. So Edward P. Jones is one person. Alice Munro is another person. I basically, I really didn't have much free time to read, so I always assigned books that I wanted to read to my classes. And so I got to read a lot of George Saunders and George Saunders' protege, Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, Friday Black, which is just an amazing, amazing short story. And yeah, that literature and teaching it and rereading it has just, I think, helped my writing tremendously.
Yeah.
What about you? Influence? influences?
Oh, influences. Yeah, I mean, I think we share a few there that you mentioned. I mean, Alice Munro in particular, I feel like I learned so much technically from her, and I think, you know, she maybe doesn't get as much credit for the experimentation that she does. I mean, there's like some of her stories that are, I think, quite wild in
Yes.
terms of their formal structure and how much she's able to move through time. And then there were, you know, I mean, influences from Bengali literature, which in Bengali is my first language. So, you know, in this book, the last story is an homage to Rabindranath Tagore. And he was somebody I read when I was a kid, and, you know, we were forced to memorize his poems, and only later did I really appreciate them. And so there were, you know, there's canon of Bengali authors, some of whom haven't been translated, who were, you know, very important to me as well. But then also folks like Malamud, and talking about this idea of like intensity of the story. You were talking about yearning. I feel like in Malamud stories, like yearning is so important. You know, you walk into a Malamud story and you know the stakes are extremely, extremely high. And I was, you know, on the way here, I was listening to an interview and thinking about the Otto Frank quote, which is that in the future there will not be, I might mess this up, so correct me if I do, but in the future there will not be artists only art, or I'm sorry, there will not be art only artists. I always mess that up. And I, you know, I don't know exactly how to think about that quote. It's something that I think about quite a bit, and especially these days as we have the encroachment of artificial intelligence into writing, right? So like we have AI that is writing for us. I'm curious how you think about that Otto Frank quote, and in general, how you think about the evolution of writing going forward.
Oh my God, I don't know if I can answer about the Otto Frank quote, but it's so funny. One of my colleagues, Brian Morton, just sent me out of the blue, said I put type a paragraph in the style with Ferrell in chat. And he sent it to me and it was terrible. I was like, this is really my writing. And it was, first of all, it was a complete lie. I was born in the South Bronx, and, you know, I was not born in the South Bronx, but it was, I think it really drew from my first book of short stories, some of which take place in the South Bronx, but the writing was terrible. And I wrote back to him and I said, this is awful. And then he wrote and shared his, Brian Morton, wrote a beautiful novel starting out in the evening, among others. He just published a beautiful, beautiful memoir about his mom and her struggle with Alzheimer's, Tasha. He sent me his chat GPT and it was so bad. It was, you know, Brian is a very, when you read his books, he pulls quotes from Nietzsche and, you know, Freud and deep thinkers. And one of the lines that was repeated was, I'm just thinking about the meaning of life. I'm so happy about the meaning of life. Not the way you sound either. So on that front, I think if we pay attention to that, we're going to hell in a handbasket. That's why. But luckily, I think and you know, now there are a lot of scandals about people plagiarizing, and you know, but I think that if you have a story that's really important that you want to tell, you will find a way to tell it, and you will not need. Now, this is not to knock AI, because I'm sure there's some purpose for it. I just don't know what it is, but you know, I could see someone looking at Dear Miss Metropolitan and saying, why isn't it just a conventional linear novel? Why is it all over the place? Why are these fragments here? And for me, you know, I alluded to this before. It was really important that this was a community story, and these were all different voices that were telling this story, and which is something that Alice Munro does, right, in Wilderness Station. That just occurred to me actually, but Yeah, I think that, we're all driven by the things that we want to do. And if my style of writing in here is, I hope that it is engaging to people. But some people might say, well, I'd rather just have a conventional, novel beginning to end, which you could also argue this is as well. But that actually makes me think about subject matter. And I'm really curious, your novel, your beautiful, beautiful novel, takes on very heavy historical subject matter. You're dealing with the Warsaw Ghetto. You're dealing with India during the partition. You're dealing with New York. I'm just curious, and that also presents a kind of fragmentation. How did you see, like, approaching these very disparate settings and disparate histories? Did you feel that you needed a kind of fragmentation, or was this, how did you envision it?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot about memory in general, as a craft element, as a kind of overhang for fiction. And when we think about traumatic memory, and I think you do this really beautiful in your book, and explicitly so in some cases with the erasure as a form. But traumatic memory is not static. It's something that changes over time. And this idea that, you tell a story, and the more you tell it, it changes. And you are defined by the telling of it, and as you grow in age, the story also grows and ages with you. And so I think, like, to tell a completely linear story where memory of the past is so important, I just can't imagine it happening, like it doesn't seem like it would do service to the way in which we encounter narrative, in the way in which we live our lives. I mean, I know, speaking from my own monkey brain, I'll be in the moment, and then I will be thinking about something that happened when I was a child, of course, like Proust and the Madeleine, and just kind of, being in the world of my mind and my imagination. And, there's a kind of responsibility, I guess, that comes with that imagination. And I'm curious about this idea of the watcher, which I think is like a central theme in your book, and this idea of bystanders and what is the responsibility that they bear. But in some ways, the author is also a kind of watcher in this circumstance, right? So how do you think about yourself in the context of this book?
That's a really great. Well, I've had a lot of struggles. When I was interviewed during the book tour, I was interviewed by various outlets, some writers, some journalists, and very often the first question was, how much research did you do for this? Because people said, well, this is, bringing to mind the Ariel Castro kidnapping, that, the girls were liberated in 2013. How much research did you do? And I actually had to harken back to Edward P. Jones, who, when he wrote The Known World, he said, people asked him how much research, he said very little, and no one could believe that. They said, of course he did research. And I also did very little research. I struggled with the question of, is this a story that I have the right to write? Because the victims of the real life case are still alive, but my story is a fiction. My story is inspired by that, but it's not those girls. And I remember seeing the Ariel Castro, when it broke on the news, the liberation of these girls. And the first question that went through my mind was, how could girls be gone for 10 years and no one find them? And that kind of possessed me. I did do some research actually after I finished the book for the book tour. I wanted to know about missing children, and I found very grim statistics. When we know them, we may not be conscious of them, but when you see someone who was missing, a child was missing. It's usually a blonde, white girl, pretty. You know, there have been many responses to it. I became not involved, but I came to know the organization Black and Missing, which had on HBO, I think, or in Showtime, one of them. It has a 4-part documentary series, and it's really wonderful. I highly recommend Black and Missing. And it just talked about these 2 women who started this organization who felt that Black children were not being found. They weren't being sought after. They weren't, you know, these missing Black children. So they just started their own organization. And one of their main points is we need to have social media presence. So that is a place, you know, social media, television, make these cases known. So this is all to say that I felt that I was contributing something by learning about that and speaking about that on my book tour. But I never thought I'm usurping these girls' stories. I never set out to write a true crime story. This was not nonfiction, but again, that question often came up, how much research? This is, did you interview the aerial caster? That was like, no, I did not interview because this is not their story. This is a story that came from my imagination that was inspired. And I will also say that it was inspired in a kind of shadowy sense by #MeToo and Black Lives Matter. That was all kind of going on as I was writing. And I didn't sit down and say, oh, Black Lives Matter. It just all was I was a part of this, it was a part of the world I was writing in. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. And I'm so happy that you are able to say that, that because I think it's so important to be able to have a degree of authenticity with the imagination that, it doesn't have to be, a work of historical fiction for it to be a work.
Well, were you questioned about that as you were writing about the Warsaw Ghetto?
Oh, it certainly came up for me, but I don't know, Jennifer, if you're
Oh, well, I just had a question for you. While I was doing research for the introduction, I read several times that some of the journalists were writing that, oh, this title is misleading because it's here in the politics. I saw it in 2 places.
Right.
And that she's a very minor character, and I think one of them even said they counted the page numbers.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, while you were presenting, and the fact that you just read that, is that partially a stand-in for all of our complicity?
Absolutely, 100%.
And survivor's guilt.
Mismentioned politics, right? What happens when we, it's that that person who's interviewed on the news that says, "Oh, this stuff never happens around here."
Right.
What is our complicity there? What do we do? Do we notice things? Do we, and there, in reality, sometimes there is really nothing that we can do. But I wanted her to be, I think that we need to think about things and maybe do something about other things. For example, getting involved with agencies that or organizations that help missing children, domestic violence, to do something. And not just kind of saying, not in my backyard.
Yeah, I was so surprised to see those people not getting, how important of a character.
I felt that she was really like the conscience of the community, and I wanted to link her to Arab, because even though that the Ariel Castro crime, if I think about that real life analog, I felt as I was watching it, even though that took place in Cleveland, and I felt guilty. I felt like, how did I not know about this? And it was, of course, there's no way for me to know, but what is our responsibility to each other? What is our responsibility to young girls? That was in my mind.
Should we keep talking? Because I have all kinds of questions. All right. So, Carolyn, you've written short stories and novels. And I know you must get this question a million times, but I think it's an interesting one, which is, how do you think about which form to inhabit What are the markers that tell you that this is a short story?
That's so funny, because I was gonna ask you the same question. We both have written a novel and a collection of short stories, but in reverse order. I started with a collection of short stories and then wrote Dear Miss Metropolitan, and you started with a novel. Wow, that's an interesting question. I think that, as I might have alluded to before, I did think about short stories with my time frame of working full-time at Sarah Lawrence, raising two kids with Linwood, buying a house, doing all of that. I thought a lot about the short story form, and I feel that I am a short story writer. And I think that bears itself out in, I feel like this book is a collection of short stories, that's masquerading as a novel.
Edward P. Jones was kind of doing it as a novel in a way.
Yes. Although I don't want to compare myself to that God. God, don't you know that? It's funny when the book was reviewed in the Times, and one of the reviews, reviewed twice, but one of the reviews, it began in such an interesting way. It said, after 25 years, Carolyn has written a book, and it made me sound like Lazarus, the stone coming out after 25. Well, I wasn't just twiddling my thumbs for 25 years. I was actually publishing stories and, and writing little bits and coming into this novel. But it wasn't, I just thought that was an interesting way of portraying me as someone who, after 25 years, just kind of spits out this book. And I'm very grateful for the review, but I just thought it was a weird way to kind of, because I'm always writing, and short stories were so important. And, as I said, I primarily consider myself a short story writer.
Yeah.
But what was the experience like for you? You were publishing short stories while you were writing your novel.
Right. Yeah. And I also primarily think of myself as a short story writer and kind of an accidental novelist, honestly. And I certainly didn't set out to write historical fiction. This is being recorded, so I probably shouldn't say that I don't read a lot of historical fiction. But my first novel was historical fiction, and it was just one of those eureka moments where I felt like, okay, this is a kind of a set of circumstances given who I was. And just to explain, it's about a Bengali play that's performed in the Warsaw Ghetto, and I was a play written by Rabindranath Tagore, who I mentioned, and so it just felt like this is a story that I need to write about because I was so moved by it. So I think sometimes to get to my perspective on this, I think like sometimes there's some stories that we can't shake off, that kind of almost use us as a vessel to be written. And, maybe that's a little woo-woo, but I do feel like, I certainly felt that with my first novel that, I'm a short story writer. What am I doing writing historical fiction? And in general, I think the short story is such an incredible vehicle for experimentation because you can do so much, you can take so many risks. And in the novel, there's a kind of sunk cost fallacy that goes into it, right? Like, it took me 10 years to write my first novel. And, I'll say after 5 years, I was going to finish that thing, no matter how long I had to, crook, yes. I had to write it with my blood. I was going to finish that book. So, whereas a story, I think like in some way there's an openness. I don't feel sometimes that same sense of constriction that I do late in a novel. And of course I want to be open even in the novel space. But honestly, like, if you're getting into the 10th, 11th revision, like I was feeling kind of constricted, like the doors are closing, like there's only so many things I can do. Whereas in a story, you can always break it open, you can always do the unexpected. And so I find that to be such a gift of the story form.
Yeah, yeah. Should we open it up to questions from our audience? Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I want to mention George Saunders when you both mentioned it, and this question you were just answering that time. I've read, and I think I have this right, that he disagrees with you. He thinks that it's much easier, that a novel is easier in quotes because you can make mistakes in there.
Right.
Whereas in a short story, it's much more apparent. So I'm just
Yeah.
interested in your view of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's National Poetry Month, and I think certainly with the poem, right? You can't make many
Right,
mistakes
yeah.
because of its brevity, and I think that's true in the short story. I think that at least for the writers I admire, every line really matters. But there is something I think about the novel that engenders itself to a kind of repetition is going to sound pejorative, and I don't mean to suggest that novelists are repetitive, but there's something in the way in which I think plot structures end up being self-reinforcing, almost as if you are compensating for the fact that a reader might be dozing for a few moments. I mean, like, sure, there are some novels where this doesn't happen, but I will say 99% of the time, that is my experience of a novel. Yeah, there's a kind of, what do you think, Carolyn?
Well, I think that when I read, I definitely have that feeling that, there are maybe some extra words. Sometimes I think, well, this novel could be taken out 100 pages, I have that feeling, but I must say, when I was writing Dear Miss Metropolitan, I was so fanatical about every word. And I looked at it as really a series of short stories. So I, when people talk about, baggy old monster, quoting James, there are novels like that, but the ones that really stay with me are the ones that really pay attention to language and that, play with form and that innovate in some way that makes every single word count, So, I could see, I could see what George Saunders is saying. I can, totally relate to that. But I don't know. It's hard. I mean, this is my, freshman effort here, and one of the things I was just reading a really brilliant essay by Zadie Smith called "That Crafty Feeling." It appeared, it was a lecture she gave at Columbia, and she talked about the two different kinds of writers. One kind, everyone always said there are two different kinds of writers. The person that makes the outlines and does all of this stuff, and then the person that just kind of jumps in and doesn't know where they're going, that they really go sentence by sentence. And I really fall in that second category.
Kind of like
And
Amy
because-
Hudson is sort of sentence by sentence.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So but with that said, the opening has to, the opening, like, for me, the opening, like 50 pages, have to be perfect. They have to set the tone. They have to set the book in a certain direction. And I think about them maybe too much. I'm always telling my students, write the draft to its end, but I don't do it myself. I don't practice what I preach. I go over those same, 50 or sometimes 20 pages over and over until I have like the steering wheel.
Yeah.
And then I feel that the book then kind of goes much faster.
And it's very clear. I mean, absolutely. You're the 1%. I mean, like, there is no wasted word in your Miss Metropolitan. But there's something that comes to mind for me, which is about Turgenev. And for a long time, I didn't understand why Turgenev was so verbose in his stories. Like, he would, you would read one of his stories, and you would learn about the baker, the butcher, like what's on the menu for dinner. And then like 10 pages in, you would get into the plot. I was like, well, what is going on here? And I love the way in which actually George Saunders talks about Turgenev. And he said that, like, for Turgenev, like all that prose kind of was the energy to get into the good stuff And so whatever it is that we need to get into the good stuff is cool, you know what I mean? And like for Turgenev, it was this incredible amount of description, incredible amount of like enduring of the world. But then for like, you know, Carolyn or Amy, it's like, yeah, every single word counts, or, you know, Joanne Beard, I guess, falls into that category. Yeah, you know, like, but yeah, I mean, I guess I'm more like the Turgenev, but I would like to think, that I revise it, you know, before it makes its way to the reader. Thank you for the great question.
Yeah, anything else? Yes.
I wonder about between the two, either short stories or novels, the role of circumstances, meetings, missed meetings, the girls getting in touch, the anniversary coming up on that date, and how that is it more or less present in each of the two types of writing?
Well, if I'm understanding you correctly, the way I'd answer that is, there's circumstance and then there's circumstance. And when I was growing up reading, I grew up on Long Island, didn't have a lot of books in our school, but we always read stories that were very heavy on plot, and that always had plot twists. And I remember being a senior in high school and reading Hemingway for the first time, short stories, and Joyce, and I was like, what's happening? There's no plot here. What's going on? And I had to really learn about stories that were not plot driven, you know, that didn't have a plot twist. So I think sometimes stories where things kind of fit in neatly, where the circumstance, you can tell that, you know, at least I can tell those are not my favorite stories to read. Where things fit in nicely and they're tied up nicely. That said, you know, in life, things are random, but in the story, things are not random. So we do have to think about how things come together. And I think a lot about resonance and how certain details will come up in the beginning and then come up again, and they'll just achieve a certain resonance as you go on. It's a lot of work, a long time to think about that. The way I do it is when I'm writing, I always have a notebook and I write down details because my memory is so bad, I won't remember them. And I tend to write, the book I'm writing right now is like 25 plot lines. So I'm trying to slim it down a little bit and take notes because I do love thinking about resonance and about details coming back and how everything really is of a piece. I don't know, does that make sense to you?
Oh, I love how you're talking about resonance here. And I am in the process of putting together a class which is looking at poetic forms to see how they can influence fiction. So looking at things like the Zenitsu, you know, the Kimiko Han's work, for example, or the Pantun, or the Ghazal, for example. Like these are all, you know, really interesting poetic forms. None of them fall into this notion of causation, of like kind of like a structural story. And yet all of them, I think, can be really great models for this idea of resonance, for this idea of how a thing is put together. And the way I guess I think about this is you don't need to have a traditional shape, which you know, sometimes is called the Freytag's pyramid, which is kind of a story with like a, you know, exciting incident and rising action, climax, denouement. You don't have to have that. It's a shape, but I think you have to have some notion of shape, right? And I think like the discovery is to figure out what is the shape that resonates for you, right? As a writer. And I think, yeah, I mean, causation, I love causation. I think there's stories in here that are very like, you know, this thing happens, that thing happens, but then there are also other pieces that are not like that. And I think both are great and fun.
Yeah, I would say also that, you know, when I'm reading, I'm always looking for some kind of transformation.
Yeah.
You know, whether it takes place in a turning point with a turning point or an epiphany of some sort, that something has to change, you know, that there has to be room for the character to change, that the character, no matter how awful, and Marcia, you remember Robin Hemley, right? Sympathy for the Devil. No matter how horrible that character is, has to have something that we can identify with in some way. You know, we don't have to like that character, we don't have to want to be friends with that character, but something has to happen that transforms that character, however briefly. And that's something that I do think takes place in real life, although we may not live long enough to see it. But it does take, it can take place. Maybe people can stay the same their whole lives, but I would say in fiction that to have something that's really rewarding, we do want to see some kind of transformation. Yeah. Marcia, you had a question?
Well, yeah, I was just gonna ask you each, if you have a favorite character in
Oh,
in
God.
either of your books, and in Dear Miss Metropolitan especially, did you, and how, I'm not gonna even leave the question, I'm just gonna leave it with that and say, well, how do you feel about that?
Oh my God, favorite character?
Favorite character? Oh, well, yeah, I mean, so I mentioned that the last story in this book is an homage to a Tagore story. And in that the Tagore story is called The Kabuliwala. It's probably his most famous short story. And it's about an Afghani merchant who comes to form a relationship with this family in Calcutta. And this Afghani merchant who's lost so much starts to develop this really sweet relationship with this young girl. And, you know, he gives her little treats and they, you know, have this kind of like really sweet relationship that develops over the years. But then as she gets older, she's no longer interested in this visiting, you know, merchant and his stories and his, you know, dates and things and whatever else that he has brought. And it's heartbreaking for him because she's like this, you know, substitute child that he lost. And that was such a seminal story for me when I grew up, this story of the Kabuliwala. And I wanted to come back to that story. Yeah, and it was such a risk for me to do that. But the last story, the Kabuliwala, it's so in the Tagore version, it's told from the point of view of a Bengali father, the daughter's father. But in my story, it's told from the point of view of the Afghani merchant. And so for me, the Kabuliwala is probably my favorite character.
Point of view is everything, right?
Point of view is
everything. That's right. You know, I have to say in Dear Miss Metropolitan, I love Miss Metropolitan. So I love Matilda. But I also love there is a social worker who takes care of the girls, and her name is Miss Refuge. And she's a character I really love because she has all of these ambitions in her life. She wants to do all of these things, but she winds up and I say just taking care of the girls, because that is really, it becomes her life's mission. And so I really feel for her, someone who has these dreams, but is also living a life of service. So I would say she is one of my favorite characters. I had a lot of fun. I have a character in here who is, you know, I must admit, who's a little bit like Dr. Phil. And I had so much fun writing that character. I loved it because he is interested in the girls, but also ratings. And I just loved, you know, the questions and the way he was, you know, and he actually brings up a really important, for me, a really important theme, and that is of somehow, how do you achieve closure? And that people think closure is a thing that you can get. Whereas, you know, what I hope is revealed in the book is that closure is just something that goes on and on and on and on and on, that you're always achieving. You don't have that one day where it just happens and then it's over. And, you know, for TV ratings, it's nice to have closure happen in an hour. In real life, that's not how it works. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for that.